college football nerds doing back-to-back Ohio State games. Going to talk about Ohio State and Michigan State after that beatdown they just put on Nebraska. And I know all of y'all are already going to talk about the model and how we had the game close and blah, blah, blah. We'll get to all that later. I just want to let y'all know, with all this discussion about Clemson dropping down to number 2, we're actually doing a top 10 video this week, and Josh and I both have Ohio State number 1. And if you want to find out why we go in depth on it, maybe watch that video. Please remember, like and subscribe. It helps the channel out a whole lot. I want to tip my hand a little bit early, Josh, so we can get into this discussion. I got Ohio State in this game. Sorry, Michigan State fans. I know you're ranked. You probably shouldn't be. I hate to start off negative. But for me, I am interested in what might be an actual decent defense that Ohio State faces and see how they do against a good defense. Josh, is there any concern in this game for Ohio State offensively against a Michigan State defense that gave them all they wanted last year?
One of the interesting things that happens with different offenses is that they scale in different ways and at different rates. And so I'm going to sort of step back and talk about Nebraska to lead into how this works with Ohio State. When you have an offense that relies a lot on spread concepts, that offense tends to operate at a very high level if it can get like 6, 7, 8 yards per play. And the reason for that is it has a high completion percentage, it has a lot of runs, and if you're getting 6 to 7 or 8 yards per play, you can move the sticks. It forces the other team to overcompensate, for example, pulling down a safety, and that gives you one-on-one opportunities for big plays. Usually in the passing game, though, some offenses can just as easily hit them in the run game, particularly if you have a quarterback like Fields, because you roll the safety. If they've got the safety roll down and your quarterback does his own read keep and the linebacker doesn't get him, there's no safety back there anymore, so Fields can run the rest of the way for a touchdown. That offensive style works so long as it moves the chains. And what tends to happen is if you're in 3rd and 7 versus 3rd and 4 or 3rd and 3, it can really change the way the offense operates. It can really change the play selection. And things can break down pretty quickly. So I said I was going to mention Nebraska. So Nebraska, that game was an absolutely absurdly dominant win by Ohio State, period. I mean, we're both hugely impressed. We are not overreacting or pandering by saying that we both have Ohio State number 1. It was due to the fact that we thought Nebraska at least was a reasonably good or competent team, and Ohio State just didn't break a sweat in demolishing them. But there's some interesting things to pick out in terms of Nebraska and how their offense has operated over the season. In the past few games, Illinois, Northern Illinois, Colorado, they've been in 6 to 8 yards per play, really more like 7 to 8 yards per play. And they're putting up 30 to 45 points. But in their opener against South Alabama, they were at 4.18 yards per play. And in this one, they were at 4.1 yards per play. Now, they were more effective against South Alabama, still managed to score 35 points, which is a miracle in and of itself, given 276 yards. I know there were other ways that were able to score in that game. What you saw in the Ohio State game was 4.1 yards per play, which is not horrendous, okay? 4.1 yards per play is not good, but usually you can get some offense out of that. But in that game, I know there's garbage time, and we've had a million people talk about garbage time. There's a lot of reasons why you don't want to go into that too much. But when you had that kind of production with Nebraska that is a very much a spread offense system, now theirs is more about rolling the quarterback out, throwing it short. It can really break down because once you get Young rushing the passer, and now the throws are rushed, you're missing conversion opportunities. You start going 3 and out really fast because you go from 4 yards per play where you go, maybe you get 3 or 4 yards, you get 3 or 4 yards, and you got to get a third down and you miss a pass. Then now you're punting. Where if you had 6 yards per play, you can afford to go, 6 yards, incompletion, 6 yards, incompletion, and you're still moving the chains because you do it in a couple downs rather than constantly needing 3. So that's kind of the way everything scales. And our curiosity from Ohio State in this game, how much does their offense scale against a good defense? Because I don't know that we really have seen that yet from Ohio State in terms of their offense versus somebody else Maybe not on Ohio State's level, but at least nobody on the level of Michigan State.
You mentioned that, I think we picked this game 2-score win for Ohio State, something like that. Neither one of us thought it was going to be that close. We did think Nebraska would do better offensively, and they didn't. To me, this game is the difference between the Ryan Day era and the Urban Meyer era. And we said this in the preseason, that we don't expect those knucklehead games that Ohio State had once or twice a year under Urban Meyer. It's just different. It's a little more business feeling, and it just seems like they're so much more buttoned up. Now, as it relates to Michigan State, the thing that concerns me if I'm a Michigan State fan going into this game is you've already had a game that has the offense that looks like last year's offense. You had a 10-7 game. You lost to Oregon 7-6, I think, in your bowl game last year. You had a 10-7 game versus Arizona State, who has a pretty good defense, but you're a ranked team. You're about to play Ohio State. You got no business scoring 10 points against Arizona State. The Indiana game was 40-31, but it was really 33-31. We all know what happened at the end of that game. And Ohio State just absolutely earholed Indiana. And we don't do a ton of transitive property here, but I think people that say transitive property doesn't matter and that's silly, it does matter. It absolutely matters. And if it didn't matter, we wouldn't care about the fact that Clemson struggled against A&M and then struggled against North Carolina. Those are data points because of who else those teams have played. So I don't want to completely turn this into an Ohio State love fest and turn all the Michigan State fans off right now. But does it start and end with that Indiana game and the fact that they've already lost to Arizona State to say that the huge number that Vegas is putting out there is probably too low?
I think it's distinctly possible. Now, a lot of it is how much credit do you want to give Michigan State defensively? Because offensively, I don't think they're going to score a lot. That's just the reality of the situation. Like you said, Michigan State has had clunkers in the past. They have that 7-10 game to Arizona State. Arizona State is not an elite team. They have a close game against Indiana. They had a slow game where they managed to pull away against Northwestern. Now, Northwestern, they win 31-10. They put out 4.75 yards per play in that game. Again, I want to highlight the fact that Michigan State's offensive production against Northwestern, 4.7 yards per play, only slightly higher than the 4.2-ish yards per play that Nebraska just had against Ohio State, actually. They just managed to somehow get 31 points out of it. A lot of it has to do with offensive consistency. We can have a much longer discussion about that. Michigan State's offense has not been great. The biggest thing I will say in their favor, when they get 3.88 yards per play against Tulsa, that's horrendous. They still managed to score 28 points. So there's at least some confidence there that Michigan State can generate points on the board when their offense isn't actually doing it by moving the ball, consistently. But I still think you have the concern that is not great. And then getting back to the point, I think you're just as concerned about the defensive numbers. So when you look at Indiana struggled somewhat offensively against Michigan State, but not that much. They had 350 yards of offense, 5.1 yards per play. Indiana, it wasn't just that Ohio State scored 51 points on them. They had 3.8 yards per play on Ohio State. Indiana could not move the ball. So that's not just about comparing the defenses. The concern for me there is Michigan State's defense really wasn't that dominant in that game. And Western Michigan had over 5 yards per play. There are signs that Michigan State's defense, while quite good, is not the elite, top-end elite unit it was before. You take those two things and put them together, an offense that I think is probably not going to be very functional, but probably is going to score points. Not a ton of points, just some points. I think that's maybe underrated. I think the real problem here is not Michigan State's offense not being able, maybe being shut out. The problem is Michigan State's defense is probably going to give up a lot more yards and points than people are accustomed to.
Yeah, and we've seen for a couple of years now, Michigan State, if they had look, Mississippi State is the perfect example of this. right now this year, and we said it coming into this year, and we saw it this Saturday, we said Mississippi State is going to be 2018 Mississippi State's offense, which is terrible, without 2018 Mississippi State's defense, which was the best in the country. Number 2 on that list behind Mississippi State was Michigan State. If Michigan State had even an above average defense or a good defense, they wouldn't have gone to a bowl. They would have been a 2-12 type team because their offense is that bad. I think they're better than they were last year, but it's tough for me. And I'm looking at that 31-10 versus Northwestern being their best data point. Talking about transitive property, just for a side minute, that scares me a lot if I'm a Wisconsin fan. Northwestern is not good. Gave Wisconsin a little bit of more than they wanted this Saturday. That's a side. And that, I've gone back and forth with a couple of guys on Twitter. Kyle Lamb, I know you're watching, so shout out to you, who have been on me this year about being down on Ohio State opponents. And the two are completely separate. Look, I don't think Ohio State's played anybody that would challenge any top team remotely close. I think Nebraska sucks. They suck worse than I thought they would. We said coming into this season they weren't a ranked team. They wouldn't be ranked when they played Ohio State, and they've sucked this year. They're worse than I thought. But to the point that I made last week, Ohio State is handling their business, where last year we saw Nebraska gave them all they wanted. Nebraska sucked last year. So Alabama's going out, and their second-team defense is giving up a couple touchdowns late to Ole Miss. Ohio State ain't doing that. And so we're seeing some of the signs that Ohio State is just this dominant team. I wonder, though, now I want you to get into the model a little bit and let me know, what does the model say? Remind everybody what the Vegas line is. Let's talk about the model. And then I know Ohio State fans are going to kill us for the model, but remind them how it gets better over time.
So, and we went over the model last week, so I'll spend a little less time. The model uses comparative statistics, mainly yards per play statistics, generates a picture of how you've done against your opponents versus how your opponent's done against everyone else, totally comparative metrics. It then, based off how your games have gone, it builds a scoring model unique to your individual team. And the basic idea is we're not trying to just put, points per yard here, but as we talked about, offenses and defenses scale, and it tries to figure out, what are your thresholds? What does it take to score points? Factoring in, to the extent that it's a predictable thing, things like, turnovers and special teams and, how much points you can generate from yardage. For example, Michigan State can actually generate quite a bit of points for the yardage they have. Slight spoiler. One of the intermediary stats that's generated by our model is something called opponent percentages allowed. So if you allow 6 yards per carry, your opponents is average 8, you allow 75% of their average. It's a plain neutral statistic, but it's probably a little more useful than most plain, pass rush statistics because it's entirely comparative. Ohio State's allowing 69% of opponent rush averages, 68% of opponent passing averages. A lot of those numbers, particularly the rush percentage, is probably impacted quite a bit by garbage time. Most teams give up a lot more on the run later in the game. I don't factor out garbage time, by the way, completely, partly due to the fact that I don't have access to those data sets. I would have to have a per play data set and run the model in that manner.
I want to interrupt you on garbage time because this was a big thing for my Ohio State fans last week. But what they don't realize is in this instance and why it matters and why we've got Ohio State number 1 versus Alabama is garbage time. Because to me, garbage time is not a complete teller of the story, and there's some lies in there, but it also speaks to your depth. Alabama got blown out by Clemson last year because of lack of depth on certain positions in the defense. And Alabama right now is giving up a touchdown with 14 seconds left versus South Carolina and a touchdown with 5 seconds left versus Ole Miss because their depth stinks. And so Ohio State fans killed us for not throwing all that stuff out, but I think it's relevant because of that very thing. Depth matters when you're playing a good team.
It does. And again, it really comes down to the fact too, I designed my model where it takes the numbers and it spits out its result. And I don't really tell it what's important and what's not important. It figures it out itself to try to basically graft the best story it can from the data that it's presented. I don't want to stick my hand in and say, oh, but you need to consider this injury and this garbage time needs to be thrown out, because then at some level I have to object my opinion. And we'd rather have a less accurate model, frankly, that is neutral than a more accurate model. And I could make it more accurate by sticking my hand in it because I want to have a neutral baseline for our discussion. Ohio State in this, 69%, 68%, getting back to the point, those are elite numbers. The pass defense number below 70% is crazy good. Numbers don't get below 75% very often. You can do better than 70% against the run, but the problem for Ohio State, they're allowing 2.3 yards per carry. Their opponents have just sucked. And you can't really distinguish yourself when, for example, Miami of Ohio has 2.0 yards per carry. That's atrocious as a rushing average. The best defense known to man, you have that one random game, right? Tulsa gets held to negative 73 rushing. That doesn't happen in reality. Most of the time, they hit the line of scrimmage, fall forward for a yard. You take that 3 times in a row and watch them punt. So it's really hard to hold teams below their average if they're like 2-3 yards per carry. Michigan State, 48% of opponent rushing averages. Again, that Tulsa game helps. 80% of opponent passing averages. That 48% number is just stupid good. The 80% number is really right, very, very good. Not quite elite. I like to see it around 75% to call you truly elite, but really anything 80% or below is fantastic. Hard to hold teams below their passing averages. Passing travels well. Passing travels better against better defense than rushing does. It's very consistent, and our model has shown that with zero doubt over the past several years. All this turns into Ohio State averaging about 4.8 yards per play, Michigan averaging 4. It's projecting Ohio State 27 and Michigan State 19. One more thing, because I know I've been talking too long, but I want to make a point on this, and I'll turn it back to you to sort of discuss it. It's the difficulty of a model understanding what the statistics are and understanding how fluky certain games are, especially with limited data sets. The thing that is screwing this model up is the Tulsa game. And the reason it's screwing it up is Michigan State had 3.88 yards per play, and they scored 28 points. And my model is designed to draw its own picture of how the stuff's supposed to work, and it's saying Michigan State can score points without having hardly any yards. And Michigan State can find a way to score 15 or 20 points in a game just through, the old day you'd call it Beamer ball with Virginia Tech, right? You'd have a miserable game and they'd still score 20 points on you. That's what it's saying. If they had scored 2 points on Tulsa, this game would be projected to be 27-6. So that is how important that game is, and it's a reflection of, one, how weird Michigan State's offensive production should be, which, by the way, is a red flag. You've got to be very careful in projecting this game because Michigan State has a genuine ability to make it closer than they should. But it's also an indication of how, when you have such little data, models get really screwy, and it's seeing way too much probably out of one game, and it's making the model look messy.
Yeah, and it's funny because we've run into this a couple of times before where I think it was South Carolina last year who, for whatever reason, managed to put up 30 points and have 275 total yards. I think they did it against Missouri last year, and it threw our model sideways because the model is saying, if you do this and you score this, then if you do that again, then you're likely to score that again. And in most cases, it tends to be pretty accurate. Right now, our model is, I think, within a point or so of what Vegas is projecting the other game that we reviewed this week, or previewed, and that's the Auburn and Florida game. But sometimes it just doesn't know what to do with certain things, and that's the case here. I'm going to go ahead and give my prediction. I think it's wrong on both accounts. And again, like you said, and I love that you pointed out, the model is our talking point, starting point for a discussion. And it's our starting point for what the data is saying. And we either infer from that something that is meaningful or not. And I think some people get pissed off because they bet based on what our model says instead of listening to us. I think the model's off on both counts. I think it's given Michigan State's offense a little too much credit, or maybe Ohio State's defense not enough credit. I do think that Michigan State scores more. Look, if Nebraska doesn't have a gross overthrow on a wide open wide receiver, a ball doesn't get tipped and intercepted on, somebody's back. And that's a walk-in touchdown, and maybe Nebraska scores 14 or 17 points. They still get blown out, but that would change these numbers a little bit. I think give me Michigan State somewhere in the 13 range. I do think that Ohio State scores a little less because they're going to play this game a little differently, knowing that Michigan State does have a good defense, not an elite defense. For a couple of years now, they've had an elite defense. This is not the same Michigan State defense. Ohio State fans, don't think your offense, if you put up a number here, don't think your offense is the greatest thing ever. It still might be, but it should have a question mark because of your opponents. Still got you number one. Don't get mad. Oh, by the way, red shirt. Y'all been killing me for a blue shirt. Red shirt. So I don't want to hear it anymore. Let's go 13 for Michigan State. Give me 38 for Ohio State, and then let me know what you got.
So I have it 34-13. Once again, we're fairly close. Michigan State scoring is probably not going to reflect their yardage. I do think with Lewerke, they have the ability to throw the ball down the field and make some plays. They've been able to do that the past few years offensively. I just don't think when push comes to shove that they're really on Ohio State's level. I think Ohio State defensively is better than Michigan State is defensively. I think offensively it's a ridiculous no contest between who's better. And then when you talk in terms of matchups, Ohio State's going to be able to put up 20, 30 points. And I think they're going to hit like a 34 number, and they're going to have to work to get it. And it's going to take 4 quarters. And this game is probably not going to look completely out of hand by halftime. Maybe it's like, 17-0 or something. But it's going to take them the full 4 quarters of the game, but I don't think it's going to be particularly close. So that's where I get, 34-13. The Vegas line, which is not impacting my decision here, is like 20.5. I think that's really right on where this game should be. The whole thing to me really is the takeaway. What happens when Ohio State plays a better defense? How much does this offense scale? How much do certain things slow down? I don't think Ohio State should be able to run the ball at will. And so my curiosity is when they can't run the ball overly successfully, how much does that impact everything else they're going to do, especially if Michigan State can actually play them honest, keeping a safety over the top. It's going to be fascinating to see. And again, it's going to be funny when people complain about the model. Again, the model's a baseline. And we do it sometimes to say, again, think the model here really, let's consider the model being like 27-2, not 27-19. That's really where it ought to be, looking at how everything should be. Does Ohio State score more or less than like a 27-point margin? I think the offensive production, it's pretty accurate on its Michigan State score that it has no idea what to do with. That's your baseline. And so if they score more than 27, it's sort of saying that's exceeding expectations. Less than 27 is not. Same reason it had a close model, Auburn and Mississippi State. And the reason these things are useful is it tells you Auburn really, really outperformed a very neutral expectation. So your neutral expectation here is about 30 points. And depending on which way it swings, it's one data mark. It's not all telling. People have up and down games, but it's going to give us an idea. If they can put up 50 instead of 30, we still don't know where their ceiling is. And if they put up 20 in this game, then we go, okay, well, maybe there is some issues in terms of scaling. And that's by far the most interesting thing to me about this game.
Yeah, I think that Ohio State fans need to remember we're scrutinizing your team as what we're saying is the number one team in the country. Meaning, when we talk about if your offense scales, we want to see you put up 38, 40 points against Michigan State, because at some point you're going to play Alabama. You're going to play Clemson, Georgia, one of these teams. And their defense, even with all of Alabama's struggles this year, their defense is better than Michigan State's. Full stop. Their defense is better than Michigan State's. So that's where you have to look at yourself and say, okay, do I reasonably think I can score 35 against Michigan State? Because if you roll out a 23-3 game against Michigan State, there are red flags there. That's a 20-point win, and that's a concern. I don't think you will. That's why I got Ohio State number 1 right now. I think they're the most complete team until we see Alabama's defense show up, Georgia's offense look a little better, or LSU's defense show up against somebody. That's it for us. I think that there's probably not too much more we can talk about without pissing off every Michigan State fan in the world. So, y'all, that's it for us. Please remember, like and subscribe. Helps us out a lot. And also, you're going to want to watch our top 10 video this week, since we do explain why Ohio State's number 1 and not Alabama. And y'all always call us SEC homers, and really, I think you'll just find out that we go where the data goes, and sometimes that's favorable for the SEC. Sometimes it's favorable for y'all. That's it for us. Thanks so much. God bless. Have a good week.